Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today I wanted to talk about something that I discussed very briefly on last week's podcast with BSOLZ as we were talking about the Bulls Otto Porter trade and just talking about the Bulls in general. I kind of stumbled into this conversation about what I believe to be the most overused phrase in the NBA community right now. Just go ahead and listen. I feel like probably one of the most overused phrases, whether it be Twitter, NBA community in general, is young core. Everybody has a young core. If you have like three players under the age of 23 that have scored a basket in the NBA, it's part of your young core. It drives me nuts. If you're considering a player as part of your young core, then you're telling me that whenever you decide to be good, they are on the team that you make the conference finals with, right? Yeah. And so my question would be, if you were a Chicago Bulls fan or you're just looking at their team, at whatever point the Bulls end up being good with this group of players, whatever point that is, are Chris Dunn and or Zach LaVine on the team in which you make the conference finals? And so basically what I'm saying in this video, and the point of this is for you guys to have a discussion about this and either argue the point for or against what I'm saying. You could say that these players or these cores are part of the young core of these teams, or you could say that they're not, or you could argue my very definition of it. That's fine. I just want to have a conversation about what a young core is and isn't, and what teams do and do not have one. And the reason I bring this up is because, like I said, this just seems to be a very overused phrase. It seems like at least a third of the league's fan bases believe that their team has a young core. And in my mind, in addition to the criteria that I gave in the last section, you also have to have at least three guys, I would think, that qualify as part of your young core, because core to me obviously doesn't mean one player. Two doesn't really seem like enough. That's more of a pairing. Core to me implies a core group of players, at least three guys that are ideally like 24, 25, or younger. And really the only exception I could see to that is you could probably stretch it and say it is only two players if they're immensely talented. Like prior to this past season, you could have said that Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid were the Sixers' young core, and just those two guys would have sufficed. Obviously, we're discounting Markelle Fultz as part of this equation, but because they're so talented, you could put those two guys in that equation. But for the most part, for me, all the criteria that I mentioned before would have to be a part of the equation in order to qualify someone as a young core, or a player or group of players as a young core for a team. First up are the Denver Nuggets, and this is a team that, in my opinion, does qualify for the phrase young core, and it's not overused to use it for the Denver Nuggets. Harris is 24, Murray is 21, and Jokic is 23. And the first point that I made in the podcast was whenever the team decides to be good, then these players are a part of the team that ends up either making the conference finals, or it doesn't even have to be that specific, but you're a good playoff team. And that's what the Nuggets are right now with this core group of players. I can't really see an argument against why this would not be considered a young core. And I wanted to start off with the Nuggets because I feel like they're a very good example, and I don't really think you can make an argument against them being considered, like I said, a young core. Next up is another team out west, and that is the Sacramento Kings, starting off with De'Aaron Fox, who is 21, Marvin Bagley, who's 19, and this is really where it got kind of weird for me. I struggled to find a true third guy, and this is where you could start to make the argument that the Sacramento Kings do not have a true quote-unquote young core, because the third guy is Harry Giles, who is very promising and an up-and-coming young player. And for me, I don't really see Harry Giles as a borderline all-star caliber guy. I think he's going to be a good player, and maybe he will be around for the Kings when they are a very good playoff team. They might be a playoff team this year, but in terms of being a conference finalist contending team, that's not them this year. And I'm just not convinced that Harry Giles is going to be on the team when they do actually reach the potential of the other two young players that I talked about, being De'Aaron Fox and Marvin Bagley. The other things that kind of keep them out of this conversation are the fact that Buddy Hield is a little bit older, and again, they just don't really have anybody else that fits this mold. Harrison Barnes is a little bit over our age threshold as well. So for now, unless there is some big development in Harry Giles' game and he becomes someone that I see or that you see as a borderline all-star caliber player, I would say the Sacramento Kings probably don't have a young core. They more have a young two players, being De'Aaron Fox and Marvin Bagley. Next up now is the team that kind of started this whole conversation for me on the podcast, and that is the Chicago Bulls. And again, I'm taking a bit of a step back from the comments that I made on the podcast, because at the time I said that I felt like the Chicago Bulls have a two-player quote-unquote young core, that being Lauri Markkanen and Wendell Carter Jr., both of which are very good young players. They fit the age threshold. They both are borderline or potentially all-star caliber players moving forward. And the two players that I left out of this conversation for the Bulls' young core was Zach LaVine and Chris Dunn. And I feel more strongly about Chris Dunn than I do Zach LaVine, because obviously LaVine has been a very productive player this season and has shown a good amount of promise. But Dunn, I'm not convinced that he is the point guard of the future for the Bulls. In my opinion, he is a rotation point guard moving forward, but he's already getting up there in age in terms of this young player conversation, and he's probably just a really good backup point guard in the league. He's not an outstanding playmaker. He's a very good defender, but offensively, I don't think he does enough off the ball or on the ball to really be considered an all-star caliber player in the future. So I don't really think that Chris Dunn is going to be the point guard of the Bulls at whatever point they decide to be really, really good. So I don't consider him to be part of the core. And the only other problem I have is, again, with Zach LaVine, just because I'm not convinced that he, once again, is going to be on the team when they do decide to be good, whenever that is. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he gets traded for another player to try and bring in a star to Chicago, or if it just takes so long for the Bulls to end up being good that LaVine finds himself on a different team. He's putting up very good numbers on a very bad team this year, and that hasn't convinced me that he is part of the future of this team, despite the fact that they obviously received him in exchange for Jimmy Butler, and this is supposed to be their core. I'm still maintaining the fact that it's two players for the Bulls in terms of a young core, but I can see why you would make an argument for LaVine. I don't see why you can make an argument for Chris Dunn. Next up is one that, in my opinion, is pretty easy, and that's the Minnesota Timberwolves. They don't have a young core. They have a young player, and that is Karl Anthony Towns. Andrew Wiggins is 23, does not look like an all-star caliber guy at any point in the near future. Dario Saric is the other guy that I put in this, but since he's come to Minnesota, his minutes have dipped significantly from his time in Philadelphia, and ever since Ryan Saunders has taken over, he's been very inconsistent in his usage of Saric, which is pretty strange, because if you're not going to develop him, then you essentially swapped Robert Covington for Jimmy Butler, but that's a different conversation. To me, in terms of players that are going to be on the team when the Timberwolves are good and potentially conference finalist contenders, it's Karl Anthony Towns, and that's pretty much it in terms of players that I'm confident will still be there, will still be on the roster, will still be an important part of the team when the Timberwolves do decide to be good. This one's very easy for me personally. About halfway there now, we have the Atlanta Hawks, and this is obviously Trae Young, who is 20, John Collins, who's 21, and Kevin Huerter, who is 20. And the Atlanta Hawks actually, especially since John Collins has come back, have won more games than they really wanted to. To this point in the season, they've played much better than they probably honestly thought that they would, once Collins came back. So they're in kind of a weird spot, and I'm pretty surprised that they were able to keep guys like Dwayne Dedmon, Kent Bazemore, and Jeremy Lin on the roster past the trade deadline, but that's a different conversation. The big issue that I have here is I do think that Young and Huerter are probably going to be on the team, and Amari Spellman as well, whenever the Hawks decide to be good. My issue here, despite the fact that he's a very good player, has been playing extremely well for the Hawks, is John Collins, only because he's like 6'8", and his long-term fit, unless he becomes like a 35-40%, consistent high-volume three-point shooter, his long-term fit is probably at the 5 spot, and he's not a great defender at that spot. So similar to LaVine, I'm concerned that even though he is being very productive, it could just be a good stats, bad team kind of situation. And in terms of a long-term fit on a winning team, on a really good team, and a conference finals contending team, I don't know that John Collins is going to be on the Atlanta Hawks when that does happen. I'm not convinced that they are going to want to give him a ton of money when his contract runs out, because I think this is a very long-term rebuild for the Hawks, and I just don't know that he is part of the future long-term young core of the Hawks, whereas Young, Huerter, and Spellman I feel like definitely are. So it's kind of weird, because I think in the overall conversation, yes, the Hawks do have a young core, but it's probably not the three guys you would initially think about, because I would take out Collins and put in Spellman. Moving on now to a team that's been in the news a little bit over the past couple of weeks, and that is the LA Lakers. And their young core is Brandon Ingram, who's 21, Kyle Kuzma, who's 23, and Lonzo Ball, who is 21. Now, I would say that yes, the Lakers do qualify as a team that has a young core between these three players, because I think in terms of trade assets, yes, they could move these players for a star player, and probably at some point are very likely to do so. But that doesn't really impact my personal opinion of these players. I'm not a very big Brandon Ingram guy, at least in terms of a fit as a complementary option, which I feel like is where he should be fitting into at this point in his career. I don't think he's going to be an all-NBA caliber player at any point in his career, so he should be much more of a complementary guy than he is right now, and he doesn't seem to be fitting well into that role. I do like Kuzma's ability as a scorer, as well as, like I said, a complementary player, and Lonzo Ball. Once he figures out his jump shot and his free throw issues, which hopefully he does figure those things out, I think defensively and playmaking-wise, he is a pretty ideal complementary option at the one, especially alongside a guy like LeBron James, like I said, once he figures out his jump shot. So they definitely qualify as a young core, but in terms of my personal opinion on their players, I don't really rank them all that high in this group, basically because Brandon Ingram is supposed to be the prize jewel of this group, and I don't really like him any better than most of the other complementary options on their team when he's supposed to be this up-and-coming young star player in the future. Moving on now to probably, in my opinion, the most interesting case study of this entire young core conversation, and that's the Dallas Mavericks, because this time 2 weeks ago they wouldn't even have been in this video because it would have been Luka and Dennis Smith, and that wouldn't even have gotten them close, in my opinion, to being part of the young core conversation, because I didn't think Dennis Smith showed enough promise to qualify for the two-player only rule. But in this case now, they probably do count. I would say that Luka Doncic and Kristaps Porzingis both are so immensely talented that you could say that they have a young core, despite the fact that they really only have two really, really good young players, especially compared to some of the other teams that I've talked about. I think if these two guys can stay healthy, if they can gel together, and obviously if the Mavs can re-sign Porzingis, whether it be this summer or the following, I think that this definitely qualifies as a young core, and one of the better ones in the league, again, despite the fact that it's only two players. Maybe you could stretch it to someone like Dorian Finney-Smith or Jalen Brunson, but maybe they even keep their pick this year and they end up with another guy, or they make some other move. But I would still qualify the Mavs as a young core, again, using that two-player rule, just because these two guys are just so immensely talented when healthy. Second to last now is a very similar team to the one that I just talked about, and that is the Phoenix Suns. Now, obviously, Devin Booker qualifies here. He's 22. He's one of the better players, young players certainly, in the league, one of the better scorers in the league. And the other guy is this past year's number one overall pick, DeAndre Ayton. The problem is, I don't necessarily think that Ayton is so immensely talented that they can, at least at this point, that they can qualify for the two-player only rule, despite how good Devin Booker is. I don't think DeAndre Ayton is quite there to help them qualify for that. And then the third player is kind of up in the air. It's like TJ Warren, Josh Jackson, no, for me personally. Mikal Bridges, like they have a couple of wings that you could kind of fit into that third spot that probably will be on the team when they're good, because they're good complementary players. But I'm just not really willing to put them in that conversation yet. I think they need one more really good young player to qualify once again for this young core conversation. So for me personally, I'm going to say no for the Suns, but I do think they're close on two fronts. One, they're close to having the third guy, and two, Ayton is 70% of the way there of being so promising that they would just qualify for the two-player only rule. And last up now is a team that is probably going to break all the rules that I've mentioned before, because on the surface it would seem like the New York Knicks do have a young core. They have Dennis Smith Jr. now, they have Kevin Knox, and then they have Mitchell Robinson alongside guys like Alonzo Trier. Maybe even you want to throw Frank Ntilikina in there if you want to. But I just don't think any of their young players are all that good right now. Dennis Smith is still kind of up in the air in terms of what his future is as a point guard, where he's going to fit in, how he's going to play with the Knicks, kind of up in the air. Kevin Knox has had an up and down rookie season. He's dealt with injuries, not really sure where that's going to go. Mitchell Robinson has played outstanding some games and completely disappeared in others. Alonzo Trier has been a nice second round find, or an undrafted find, for the Knicks, but you never really know what's going to happen with those guys beyond years 1, 2, and 3. And then Frank Ntilikina just can't score the basketball. So I'm not sure about any of those guys. I just listed 5 players, and I'm not convinced that any of them are ever going to compete for an all-star selection in the league. I would say that probably Kevin Knox is the highest on that list of potentially being an all-star in the future, and then Robinson, Dennis Smith Jr. Maybe you could convince me that they'll get there, but more than any of the other teams on this list or on this in this conversation that we're talking about, the Knicks not being a young core in my mind has more to do with the players specifically and their game specifically than anything else, especially, like I said, compared to the other teams on this list. And yeah, that's pretty much all the young cores, quote unquote, that I could find. Like I said, about the third of the fan bases in the league think that they have a young core, and I just kind of wanted to go through and give my opinion on whether or not they actually do have one, and I would appreciate if you guys would do the same thing. And the other thing is, if you think there are any other really overused phrases in the league that we should examine, take a look at. Let me know down in the comment section. I want this to be a very discussion-based, discussion-focused topic. I want to have this conversation with you guys, whether it be Twitter, comment section, whatever. I want to have this conversation. I want to talk about it, and I want to just kind of get to the core of the young core conversation and just see why we overuse it so much and whether we should stop talking about certain players, again, as a quote-unquote young core. But with all that said, once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos or my podcast, it comes out every single week. Be sure to check out the boxes on screen or for the podcast over on iTunes and Spotify. Just search Sporting Logically and you'll be able to find it over there. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.